Hello, welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum Series Winter and Spring session. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of this group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. As always, you have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. Our speaker will deliver prepared remarks for a little over 30 minutes, and then we'll take Q&A and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, more importantly, we do have a YouTube channel. I think there are about 15 talks up there, and they're getting some nice views. Please see the YouTube icon at the top of the website to access the YouTube channel. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, and candidly, someone who really doesn't need an introduction at this point, but James Ellman holds a bachelor's degree in history and economics from Tufts University and an MBA from Harvard. He has written Hitler's Great Gamble, A New Look at German Strategy, Operation Barbarossa, and the Axis Defeat in World War II, and MacArthur Reconsidered, General Douglas MacArthur as a wartime commander, which he has spoken to us about previously. This is actually his third time appearing to the World War II group, so very much appreciated. He currently lives in California. This afternoon, James will discuss his latest book, Seeds of Victory, Defeat, Triumph, and the American Way of War, which argues American defeats fueled crucial victories through resilience and strategic adaptation, shaping the nation's path from loss to triumph in warfare. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been fantastic. I'll quickly read two. Walter Borneman, author of The Admirals and MacArthur at War, writes, despite humbling military defeats throughout its history, the United States has repeatedly found a way to plant the seeds of those defeats and grow victory. James Ellman offers an intriguing and insightful account of major American defeats and convincingly argues that individual leaders have stepped out of the shadows of those defeats to find a way to win. While Robert Young, professor of American Military University and someone who's also spoken for us, writes an excellent addition to American military history, James goes beyond the victories themselves to examine how they developed from defeat. I would just echo and say it's a wonderful book. The breadth and depth of scholarship is fantastic, and we're thrilled to have James again. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Great. Well, Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you very much, Greg, for having me on again. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you very much for taking some time on your Saturday to talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is when the U.S. is defeated. And actually, even though there's a victory for every single defeat in here, I will note that this is by far the worst selling of all the books that I have written. Most people do not want to read about the U.S. winning. In any event, the United States of America is definitely a nation shaped by war. And the American way of war is usually thought to be a doctrine of striving to achieve decisive, crushing victories using overwhelming firepower against our enemies by utilizing our large industrial and manpower base. Whenever possible, we utilize that industrial might and scientific know-how to win rather than sacrificing men on the battlefield. The consensus view at this point is that our armed forces have been unbeatable throughout our history, and then somehow we lost our way and forgot how to win after World War II. However, this book tries to point out that a more accurate description is that the U.S. has consistently suffered major strategic defeats, but then, quite differently compared to many other nations, has been able to rapidly react, recover, and go on to win. This book examines this dichotomy and tries to understand why we lost so often and then found a way to prevail. I identified 8 major strategic defeats followed by victories in our history. Each one of these dots or diamonds on the map shows where we suffered a strategic defeat. The ones along the eastern seaboard and the Great Lakes in the US, of course, was very early in our history. And then we spread out around the world and found ways to be strategically defeated across the Pacific and the Atlantic. This is a World War II discussion group. So, of course, I'm going to talk about World War II. And there are 3 strategic defeats followed by victories in this book that took place in World War II. There's the loss over Schweinfurt, to the victory over the Big B or Berlin in the bombing campaign over Germany, You've got the defeat in the Philippines at the beginning of World War II, until MacArthur was able to achieve a strategic victory at Bunagona in New Guinea. And then, of course, the defeat and the bombing at Pearl Harbor until we were able to turn things around under Nimitz um, at Midway. However, I'm going to, in addition to the bombing campaign against Germany, I'm also going to start, just to show the difference in the sorts of defeats followed by victories we've had. I'm going to start with the beginning of our country in 1776, where one of the two sorts of major defeats took place. And one of those defeats, or those defeats fall into two major categories, or the victories fall into two major categories after we've been defeated. It's one, either we change our tactics and use what we have to figure out a different way to fight, sometimes with a slightly different set of goals. The other is the more traditionally viewed American way of war, which is where we're defeated and we throw a whole lot of additional scientific know-how and industrial production and manpower at the problem, also changing our tactics and are able to steamroll our opponents. So why have we lost so many times in our history? Most defeats have started right at the beginning of a war that we fought, where we often refused to prepare adequately for war in advance, even when we knew it was coming or even brought it on ourselves. Rarely were we willing to consider what the enemy could do, and instead we focused on what we wanted him to do, and we were surprised and defeated. We often tried to fight with the wrong equipment or the wrong doctrine for the training or weapon systems we had. And again, we've been willing to win by relieving commanders and elevate someone better in many instances. We have utilized our industrial might, of course, as mentioned, to overwhelm our opponents. And we've had to fight with what we've had and be willing to change our tactics in almost all instances. We've also been willing to fight along allies, even when they've been difficult to work with and their interests have not been completely aligned with ours. So let's start with 1776. Of course, and here is General Sir William Howe, leader of the British land forces in 1776, and effectively the man who lost America for Britain. As much as George Washington may be the man who won America for the United States, William Howe certainly lost it. And we'll talk a little bit about that right now. In any event, Howe was second in command in Boston at the beginning of the war, and he led the men that crossed Boston Harbor to Charleston at the Battle of Bunker Hill, where he saw more than 1,000 of his men wounded or killed. And he had been a very effective general up to that point. And after that, he became very hesitant and worried very much about losing men and tried to take territory rather than defeat the Continental Army head on and taking risks. And very much this led to the American victory in 1776 and 1777, at which point, of course, the French entered the war, and after that, the British actually began to believe that they were going to lose at least the northern of the 13 colonies. An event, of course, is I'm sure you all know, and I'm going to try and move through this relatively quickly because I'm sure most of you know the story of the early days of the Revolution. After Lexington and Concord, Washington shows up. He bottles up the British in Boston. He then gets some cannon that come from New York State, puts them on Dorchester Heights, and the British are forced to sail away. Now, William Howe wanted to, with his brother, who was head of the Navy at the time in the colonies, wanted to take New York City, the most strategic point in the Eastern Seaboard at the time. And he sailed away to Canada first to get himself reinforcements. Had he sailed right for New York, he probably would have been able to take it. There weren't that many Continentals or militia protecting it at that time. In any event, Washington knew, and the Continental Congress knew, that New York was probably the next target. And Washington sent General Charles Lee, who was a professional soldier, down to New York to ascertain the situation. And Charles Lee came back with a contradictory set of recommendations. He said, we cannot afford to lose New York. If we lose New York, we could lose New Jersey, we could lose Connecticut and Rhode Island, and the British will control the Hudson River, and then they can split New England off from the rest of the colonies. However, Charles Lee said, you cannot hold New York. If you don't have command at the sea, you can't hold New York. And if the British show up with the Royal Navy, you're going to lose. But Washington very much was trying to generate another Bunker Hill, another situation where he could inflict high casualties on the British. And he decided he was going to defend New York. And he told John Hancock that he was going to make the British wade through blood to take through New York. And he brings most of his army down to New York, and he positions it around its strategic places under Lee's suggestion. And pretty soon he has 20,000 men there. And Howe then shows up off Staten Island with 30,000 men, including a lot of Hessians, and a large fleet. So if we take a look here at what New York looked like at the time, the island of Manhattan, which was then just known as York Island, the city of New York was a small city, mostly south of Wall Street, in the southern tip of the island. And if you've been to New York, and I'm sure many of you have, a problem with defending that point is that Brooklyn Heights are right across the East River. It's not a river, of course, just an inlet of the ocean. And the heights are higher. And if you have cannon there, you can lob cannon into New York City. You can control the place. So Washington puts a lot of his troops in southern Manhattan. He puts a lot of his troops in Brooklyn Heights, and he puts men also up around here where Kingsbridge is, the one wooden bridge to where you can just walk on and off of Manhattan. So Howe takes his time. He's very hesitant, and a couple of his ships are able to push their way up the Hudson River past two strategic forts that Washington has built at Fort Lee and at Fort Washington across from it, on which is now in the upper part of Manhattan. And they're able to sail all the way up to Tarrytown and have clearly proven that they can cut off Washington's army. He should have retreated at that point once he knew that he could be outflanked at any time, but he didn't. Luckily for him, Howe, of course, lands his men in the southern part of Brooklyn, and they march inland. He's got about 20,000 men up against about 10,000 men that Washington has in what's now Brooklyn. And in the Battle of Long Island, around Flatbush, and it's a major American defeat. The Americans are able to hold relatively well for a time when they're attacked head on, but about half of the British force is sent around in a flanking maneuver and crumples up the American line. The Americans retreat back to their fortifications around Brooklyn Heights. This, of course, is the moment when the revolution easily could have been snuffed out. Perhaps Howe could have had an immediate assault on the fortifications and the men inside them, including Washington, captured or killed Washington and wiped out much of the Continental Army, but he didn't do it. Luckily for him, there was a bit of a northeast wind, so his ships could not sail up the East River to cut off any retreat from Washington. And Washington brought over another 1,000 men, including a couple of regiments from Marblehead and Swampscott in Massachusetts, who were local maritime men. They knew how to use small boats. And during the middle of the night, Washington brought all his men back to New York. The sun comes up, there's fog, he finishes getting the last of his men out, the fog dissipates, and the British see that their quarry has escaped to New York. So he's gotten away. And now the British have all the cannon still. He's left all his cannon behind, and they're aimed at New York City and can be lobbed on New York City and destroy it. He's in a poor position, and the British have had men show up, ships show up, of course, in the Hudson as well now in Long Island Sound. So he's almost surrounded. He's got a chance to escape. He doesn't try. And if we take a look at the timetable here on the right, you can see that Howe spent a couple of weeks, almost 3 weeks, until he landed men halfway up Manhattan Island at Kips Bay. That's right near where the UN building is now. Um, and Washington is able to get his forces away and move north again, luckily due to the activities of Howe, which were slow, and also Aaron Burr, who was a colonel at that time leading a regiment. He knew Manhattan very well, and he got Washington to move his men further to the west as they retreated and kept them away from the British. After that, there's a small battle of Harlem Heights, where it's a small American victory, where the advancing British come up against the Continentals and the militia and are forced back temporarily. And then we've got another couple of weeks until Howe finally decides to try and capture Washington again by landing up near Throgs Neck in the Bronx. Washington's able to retreat again. They fight the Battle of White Plains again. The Americans are able to hold off against the frontal attack, but they're outflanked and their line crumples and they have to retreat again. And now the only thing that Washington still holds is Fort Washington, and he is convinced by his men to add more men to it. And the British, of course, take advantage of this. And when Howe attacks, he uses his ships in the Hudson River, as well as men from three sides at Fort Washington. More than 2,000 Patriots are captured there. This is the worst defeat for Washington in the war, and in fact, the most bloody defeat for the Americans in the war, in that more than 2,000 of these men died in prison ships in New York Harbor over the course of their confinement. So in any event, Washington has suffered 3 major defeats in 4 major engagements. He's been strategically defeated. He's lost a lot of men, a lot of equipment. He's lost territory he couldn't lose. And things are not looking good for the rebellion. But Washington is learning what his forces can do and what they can't do. What they can't not do is stand for a long time against British forces in an open field. And what they can do is they're more mobile, they're lighter, they can take pot shots at the enemy, and they can move more quickly. In any event, as I'm sure most of you know, he retreats south through, following this, effectively this red dotted line, all the way through New Jersey, being followed by General Cornwallis. And as he's retreating, he realizes that he's getting stronger, taking on some militiamen, while the British are getting weaker as they leave men in New York City, as well as in garrisons along the way. And of course, this is when Thomas Paine is with him and writes the American Crisis, about the summer soldier and the Sunshine Patriot. If they stick around in the crisis, that's fine, but it's the men who stay with us during this tough period who will really be owed by the nation. Anyway, Howe gets down with Cornwallis to the Delaware River and looks across it, and it's December, and he decides, I'm going to go into winter quarters. I'll go get Washington and the city of Philadelphia next year. But Washington doesn't want to quit. The most European forces would go into winter quarters, but the the American colonists had been fighting the Native Americans for more than a century, and they certainly didn't quit during the winter, and that was the best time to go after the Indians and their food supplies, so they were used to fighting in the winter. In any event, of course, he decides to attack, and he takes a look at how each of these red dots is where there was a British garrison, so it's a relatively spread out British force, and there are a little more than 1,000 Hessians right across the way from him in Trenton, and there are some others down in Bordentown, and he decides to send 3 forces back on Christmas night across the Delaware. It turns out that it snows and rains pretty hard. It means that the two southern forces that are supposed to cross the Delaware to join up with his force don't even make it across the river, but his men make it across the river. And of course, we all know this famous picture. This is actually a more accurate version of the sort of boats he used and what it looked like. It's not quite as impressive, though, of course. In any event, he takes the Hessians by surprise. He's got 2,500 men versus 1,500 for them. He captures 1,000 of them, forces the other 500 to flee, gets a lot of cannon and supplies, which of course he had lost a lot. He pulls everything back across the Delaware and then comes back again a few days later with 6,500 men. And he fights the Battle of Second Trenton that many of you may not have heard of, or the Battle of Assunpink Creek. So he digs in between the Delaware and Assunpink Creek in the middle of Delaware, and he sends a lot of his light militia up north towards Princeton, where the British have a large force. Cornwallis, who's assembled a large force, about 5,000 men, he starts moving down to try and get revenge on Washington. He is attacked time and time again by the militia, fighting Indian style, not in dressed ranks, but hiding behind trees and rocks and fences. They take a few shots, force the British to form up in line of battle, inflict some casualties, and then the Patriots slip away and set up their next ambush point. So effectively, by the end of the day, they've retreated all the way down to Trenton. The British have suffered losses. They're tired, and they come upon the Americans, who are dug in on some heights on the south end of Assunpink Creek. It's been actually above freezing for several days, so there's been a lot of snowmelt, and the creek is swollen and full of freezing cold water, so they can't really ford there. Cornwallis arrives and decides to attack with what he's got immediately. He attacks with his Hessians. They are thrown back trying to cross this one stone bridge, which Washington has defended very well. And then he sends his regulars, his redcoats, in as well. They are also turned back. And in the day, this is basically, in some ways, a small version of Bunker Hill. The British lose more than 500 men, the Americans around 100 men and killed and wounded. And it's a significant victory, second victory, that shows not only could the Americans win when they were forced to, they could take some Hessians by surprise, but they could stand against the British and defeat them. Cornwallis decides, I'll go across tomorrow, I'll bag the old fox then. Of course, Washington decides not to stick around. He forms up his men and does a night march, taking the old Quaker Road a little bit to the east, leading just a few men to fire off some cannon and 10 big bonfires and make noise to make the British think that the American force is still there. And in the morning, he has made this flanking march to the northeast. He hits Princeton, where there's still a garrison. He drives the garrison back into the city, captures a lot of men, a lot of supplies, a lot of cannon, and then he moves up to Morristown, and finally, on the 6th of January, he goes into winter quarters, and now he's outflanked all of these other garrisons that the British have down in the line between Trenton and New York, and they pull most of their men back to New York. These are three small victories that took place with relatively small number of men, but the surprise and positive results really reinvigorated the Patriot cause, and it likely saved the revolution, which appeared to be flickering out, and men were starting to leave the force. Now a lot of men sign up, and also, very importantly, men like Lafayette, von Steuben, Pulaski, Duportail, de Kalb, men from all across Europe get on ships and sail in 1777 to America to join the Patriot cause. He's learned what he can do, which is fight from prepared positions, retreating when possible beforehand, inflicting some casualty, using the militia to inflict casualties and let the militia do what they can do versus what they can't do, which is stand in dress lines and battle against the British for a long time. And this strategy, this blueprint that Washington comes up with, is utilized the next year at Saratoga under Gates and Arnold, and it's also used sequentially after the U.S. almost loses the entire Deep South in the Carolinas and Georgia when Greene and Morgan are sent down there, and they use this strategy at Cowpens to Guilford Courthouse, which saves the southern states for the United States in the eventual victory in the Revolutionary War. Okay, so that shows how we learned how to win with what we had after a defeat by changing strategy. Now we're going to jump to World War II for an instance where we learned to win by redefining victory, changing our tactics and weapon systems, and we utilized our larger industrial and manpower base versus our opponents. So here's up top, we've got a B-17. Down low, we've got a B-24. These were the two workhorses of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany in World War II. The 17 was by far the better plane. It was better armed. It could take much more punishment and hits. It performed better if you had to crash it or ditch it in the ocean. Its lower wings meant that you could belly land it a lot better without it collapsing and crashing. Its fuel tanks and its plane in its wings were better positioned. They tended not to explode when hit, the same way the B-24s were, and the 24s were very difficult to fly. In fact, it was so hard to fly that pilots of the 24 flying it with their left hand on the yoke, because the right hand was for the instruments, usually ended up with a really oversized left arm because they were doing so much muscular workout, and you could supposedly tell who was a pilot of a 24 just by looking at him. So I guess you can guess which plane you'd probably rather be in. In any event, of course, interwar, the U.S. were bought into the theory that the bomber was always going to get through, was going to be able to win the war on its own, and it formed what we think of today as a bomber mafia. These planes were not cheap. They were $250,000 a piece. That's 5 times a fighter plane, counting all the training for the 10 men in one of these bombers, and we were choosing our best men for the bombers. It was almost 10 to 1 in terms of the all-in cost of a fighter versus a bomber. Not everybody bought into the bomber mafia line. Even in the Air Force, some focused on close air support, like Chennault, who of course came to fame with the Flying Tigers in China, or Kenny, who ran the 5th Air Force in Southeast Pacific and was probably the best Air Force general of the war. The Germans, of course, focused on close air support and air superiority over certain airspaces, and that's why the Luftwaffe was so successful early in the war. In any event, right after Pearl Harbor, Hap Arnold, the head of the U.S. Army Air Force, sends General Ira Eaker to England, and Ira Eaker shows up, says, hey, we're going to build the 8th Air Force here. We're going to engage in daylight precision bombing on German targets, and we're going to destroy their industry. We're going to fly in a combat box of all the planes together, so they have interlocking fields of fire. We're not going to be able to be shot down, and we're going to win the war. And the RAF by this point had already been fighting for a couple of years, and unfortunately they had learned better. Night area bombing was a much safer way to go. You'd lose many fewer planes, and they were night area bombing, just trying to hit an area of the city to dehouse the Germans, they called it. The U.S. Air Force basically thought this was inhumane and a war crime. But the British had already pulled off the Millennium Raid, where they had 1,000 total bombers hit an industrial city in the Ruhr. And the two allies agreed to disagree. The Americans would bomb during the day, the British at night, and they would bomb around the clock to keep the Luftwaffe busy. So they therefore starts off in France in the Low Countries, and it's got a relatively acceptable and low loss rate, about 3% for its missions. And of course, as it's staying just across the channel, you can see that it can be, at the time in 1943, these planes can be escorted by P-47 fighters as well as Spitfires, and the loss rates are relatively low. The U.S. is finding that their accuracy is definitely not precision, not pinpoint with their vaunted Norden bomb sight. Also, it's overcast over the continent quite often, and often the planes can't see anything to bomb at their primary target nor their secondary target. Sometimes they just jettison their bombs in the ocean on their way back to base. General Eaker starts to push out his bombers out of escort range into Germany and to hit French U-boat pens. He starts to suffer a 10% loss rate. At this point, with a 3% loss rate, and men have to fly 25 missions, they have a 48% chance of making it through those 25 missions without being killed or captured and having their plane shot down. Once you get up to a 10% loss rate, you only have a 7% chance of surviving your 25 missions. And of course, morale starts to plunge. The Germans hit the B-17s when they leave escort range in general. The German fighters hit the B-17s when they land, rearm, have a bit of lunch, and then take back off to hit the American bombers on the way back home. The American bomber crews start to joke that they are escorted all the way to the target and back. In August of 43, the point blank directive comes down from the combined chiefs of staff that we have to take out the German Luftwaffe and their aircraft industry if we're ever going to be able to stage our landing at Normandy next year or in France. And we have to destroy the Luftwaffe or degrade it so much and get it to be withdrawn from France so that we will have air supremacy over the landing beaches in 1944. So Eker goes after Schweinfurt and Rendsburg, which is a major point of aircraft production, and the former Schweinfurt is where one of the three places where the Germans were building ball bearing plants that were important for not just the aviation industry, but for all of their heavy industry. He sends a large force out, 300 B-17s, largest force the U.S. has sent out at this point. That's 3,000 men in the crew. You add in the fighters and some medium bombers on diversionary raids. It's the size of a Roman legion in the sky over Europe that we've sent over there to fight. And it's a disaster. 60 B-17s are lost, or 16% of what are sent. 170 are damaged, some of them scrapped after they land. More than 600 men, U.S. airmen, are casualties, and the factories are still there after the bombing raid. There's a lot of smoke, there's a lot of damage, but the factories are still producing at more than 50% afterwards, despite this major hit to both the men, the materiel, and the morale of the 8th Air Force. So he goes back to raids closer. Eker goes back to raids closer to England, in the Low Countries in France, where they can be escorted. But he's still under a lot of pressure to go after German industry, and he doesn't have the fighters that can give him the escort because the American bomber mafia had not been trying to build long-range fighters because they said they just could never be effective. Long-range fighters couldn't be effective against short-range interceptors, and bombers were the way to go. In October 14th, he sends 320 B-17s back to Schweinfurt to try to blow up those factories again. And this time things are even worse without any sorts of protection from escorting fighters. He loses 62 B-17s, 145 are damaged, and the production is still at 60%. And going back to this raid here, you can see each one of these dots along the flight track of the B-17s and B-24s that went out to the target. Sorry, it was almost all B-17s that day. Each one of those dots is where a squadron of German fighters attacked the U.S. bombers. So you can really see the concept of being escorted all the way. So after that second raid on Frankfurt, known as Black Thursday, again, you can see that in November of 43, the USAF, the 8th Air Force, has to withdraw its bombers from attacking deep into Europe. And they've been strategically defeated in that they can hit some targets close to the English Channel, but they can't hit the important targets inside Germany. And they're suffering huge losses that are not sustainable because you just can't continue to have losses like that on a daily basis and maintain crew cohesion and morale. So luckily, at this point after this defeat, it's time for a change. Eisenhower is brought up from the Mediterranean and becomes Supreme Allied Commander in England for what's going to be D-Day, and he brings up General Carl Spaatz to be in charge of the Air Force in England. And James Doolittle, who of course had been famous for his raid on Tokyo, has been promoted to general, and he's put in charge of what's going on at the 8th Air Force. And Doolittle really changes his strategy and tries to do what he can with what he's got, plus he makes use of what he's getting. He decides the B-17s are now the bait. The German Air Force is the target, rather than German industrial bases target. He also starts having, the US is starting to put H-2X radar in its planes. This is just a slight tweak of the British H-2S radar. You send a couple of Pathfinder bombers out ahead with the radar. The radar is not very good, but it can tell the difference between built-up areas, land, and ocean. And that's good enough to hit a city or a big target. So the Pathfinders use their radar to know where they are. They start dropping their bombs at the right place. They fire some flares off from the top of the bomber, and that tells all the other bombers to drop their bombs at the same time. No need for a great Norden bomb site. They're bombing through overcast, which is what the Americans called it. But it's clearly not precision bombing. This is area bombing, just by end of their name. But it allows for a much higher chance of hitting, at least getting some bombs on the target, versus not bombing at all because it's overcast. And it makes the B-17s much more effective and pulls more German fighters up to meet them. And then also the US is starting to have a big increase in the number of planes arriving in Europe at this time, and Doolittle and Spaatz are able to make use of them. You can see after December 43, this kink upwards in the slope of the number of planes in inventory for the US Air Force in Europe. And then most importantly, he starts to get large numbers of long-range fighters, including the P-51, probably the best fighter of World War II. This plane can fly with drop tanks all the way to Berlin and back, or all the way to the Austrian border and back. It can also carry 2 500-pound bombs. So 10 of these Mustangs, which of course cost 1/10 of a B-17, they can carry more bombs than the average B-17 is carrying on a raid over Germany. They're faster, they're more maneuverable, and they're able, in dive bombing, to be much more accurate in their bombing. So perhaps the US should have just built P-51s and not B-17s in the war. In any event, Doolittle then makes his most controversial decision, which is he has these long-range fighters fly ahead of the B-17s, because the German aircraft are setting up in concentrations ahead of the B-17s because they can see them coming with radar, and he sends the Mustangs ahead to go break up those German fighter concentrations and kill Luftwaffe fighters. The bombing crews, of course, are very unhappy to see their escorts fly away from them, but the effect is very significant. And you can see here from the number of fighters on hand, and increasingly these are moving from P-47s to the pilots actually are retrained on P-51, switch to P-51s. You can see from the right-hand column, the number of fighters move from 500 to 1,000. They double over the course of 1944, even with the losses, and these are longer range fighters and better fighters. And so now you can see that after the P-38, not the best plane, but did help out along with the P-51, Germany is well within fighter escort range from planes flying from East Anglia in England. So this leads to Big Week in February 44, often known as Operation Argument, big attack on the German air industry. We send out 1,000 bombers over that week, and many, of course, flying multiple missions, as well as 800 fighters. It's 4,000 bomber sorties during the week. The US loses 225 of them. It's 5.5% loss rate, pretty high loss rate, but the Luftwaffe loses much more. And thanks to Operation Argument, Doolittle then realizes that if he can continuously pound Berlin, the Luftwaffe will have no choice but to send up its aircraft, its fighter aircraft, to defend the capital of the Third Reich. And he attacks what they call Big B, and he sends out 5 raids on Berlin in March. In one raid on March 8th, there were 620 B-17s and B-24s. With 900 fighters, he only loses 18 bombers, and the Germans take a much heavier losses. And you can see on the right-hand chart here that even though, of course, the 8th Air Force was taking big hits, in February, the German fighter pilots in theater lost more than a third of their total pilots. And then in March, they lost more than half of their pilots in theater. And as the pilots are being lost, you're getting much younger and less experienced fighter pilots on the German side. And so their abilities are significantly diminished. And the Germans are forced to pull the Luftwaffe back away from out of France, back to Germany to try and defend their industrial core. And the U.S. is able to put upwards of 1,000 fighters over Germany every day. And of course, we know what happened in June of 1944, D-Day. The U.S. lands with air supremacy. The U.S. has basically been able to achieve its strategic victory, though it's a different victory than the one they thought they were going to achieve. After, let's be clear, the bombers didn't get through. The bomber mafia was wrong. The bombers didn't end the war, at least in Germany. With atomic weapons, of course, that's different in different conversation in Japan. But it's not necessarily clear that the 8th Air Force was worth it in terms of the numbers, in terms of the loss of men, the cost of the planes, and the money involved. Some have written that this was, I'm not being fair, I'm not honoring the courage of the men in the 8th Air Force, not at all. They showed amazing courage. They took amazing and accepted amazing losses. The 8th Air Force had 350,000 men in it over the course of the war. That's of those, 210,000 were flight crew and 26,000 were killed. That's 12%. The Marines in the Pacific had a smaller force and had only a 3% killed in action rate. So the 8th Air Force was probably the most deadly major unit to be assigned to in World War II. So I'm now going to summarize, and then hopefully we can open it up for questions. I hope, I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit over. The U.S. has suffered a remarkably large number of victories, but also a remarkably large number of strategic defeats in its relatively short history, often followed by rapid recovery and reaction that's led to a victory. Unlike other militaries, we've been able to learn quickly from our mistakes and find a way to win. Something here we should be aware of is that we have not prepared for the next war appropriately and often suffered our big defeats at the beginning of a major war. And I hope the American people and the U.S. military might be able to take that into account, and hopefully we will not be surprised and defeated if we have a future war where we may not have been developing the right equipment and preparing correctly and taking too much time thinking about what the enemy could do rather than what it did do. In any event, Greg, I'll be happy to take any questions you have, and thank you so much for the time today. And I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than my half hour.
No, not at all, James. That was wonderful. Just to go through the usual instructions for the Q&A, you can either type your question in the bottom of the Q&A box, or you can use the raise hand feature. And I see we already have a few questions in the queue. Mark, I'll call on you first, and then Mike, I'll go to you. Mark, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg. And thank you very much for the James for the presentation. I guess I'd like to take a kind of a devil's advocate kind of a question and ask, well, or to point to other militaries who do the same thing in terms of adjusting. If you just think of World War One, the British adjusted their tactics, the French adjusted their tactics, the Germans did, the Russians did. You go through all sorts of wars where people have changed, faced, some sort of defeat or lack of victory and changed. So I'm wondering, maybe is what you're saying that the Americans are just quicker about this? And if so, how do you actually quantify that over different wars and different technologies and things like that? Seems like it would be really complicated to quantify something like that if that's what you're doing. So if that's kind of a question, if you don't mind.
No, thank you, Mark. Appreciate the question. I definitely agree. The British, of course, are somewhat famous for losing every battle in war except the last one. That's one of the sayings about them. The French, despite their reputation of being defeatist, they won a lot of their wars in history, of course. Um, and certainly the Germans have shown an ability to recover and react after losses as well. What's different about the U.S. versus, let's say, Britain, which has been able to react and after losing and win wars, is the U.S. has had strategic defeats a remarkably large number of times over the course of its history in all sorts of battles, often for a similar set of reasons. But it has been able to recover and react and change commanders and change its tactics and change its strategy and find a way to achieve a strategic victory, often in just a few months, much more quickly than anything the British or the Germans or the French have done, and have been consistently more likely after defeat to find a way to achieve a victory, using many of this, again, the same strategy or the same factors leading to the turnaround. So what I would argue here is that the U.S. has been unusual, extremely unusual in its ability to recover from a defeat and find a way to achieve victory, often within just a few months. I mean, if you think about, again, of course, the most famous example might be Pearl Harbor to Midway in 6 months. And Nimitz didn't even get really many more ships than he had at the beginning. He did lose a couple aircraft carriers and he got a couple others, but he certainly didn't get some huge number of industrial might and manpower behind him in that period of time. Similarly with with Washington, as we just talked about, he found a way to use a small number of the Continentals and the militia he had in hand to find a way to win. So again, it comes down to the U.S. has been defeated more quickly. It's been defeated for the same reasons, but it's really found a way to turn things around and achieve victory more quickly. I even have a final chapter in this book, maybe a more controversial chapter in this book, talking about Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and whether or not those were strategic defeats in an entire war, or were they just a defeat in a battle of a bigger war, the bigger war being the Cold War or the global war on terror, as described by or defined by our presidents. So it's something that has continued through U.S. history, and the question is whether or not in those final instances that I just mentioned, the post-World War II instances, you will note that in these insurgencies, our counterinsurgency tactics changed very quickly. And pretty quickly, the U.S. military was able to, after being defeated in the field by the Viet Cong or the Afghans or the Iraqis, be able to stabilize the situation for the military on the field of battle, at least long enough for our presidents and diplomats to negotiate what we saw as an exit that was acceptable to us. So this is not just something that ended at World War II. It has continued past that, and the U.S. has had a pattern that I don't think any other military or nation in the world has exhibited in its history. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, kind of. I guess it would be harder to prove it quantitatively, and that's a really difficult thing.
Sure. I mean, maybe something more on the kind of the air battle over Germany in World War II. That's something that was an attritional battle using numbers and numbers of planes lost by each side. But most of these battles were not ones that added themselves or made it easy to use quantitative calculation. But I do think that the U.S. being defeated more than 10 times in less than 300 years in a strategic manner, that's quantitatively much higher number than any other nation in the world. And the fact that we've been able to turn around and achieve victory in our wars in a relatively fast period of time, again, that's also better than any other major military in the world. So quantitatively, there are more defeats, more quick shifts to victory, and I think that should be considered as part of the American way of war.
Interesting. Isn't there a quote by Rommel to that point?
I mean, he had I'm not sure exactly which quote you're talking about. I mean, he definitely talked about how the U.S. Had good equipment and good men, and they were able to recover and learn on the battlefield very quickly when he took them on, both in Africa and then to a certain extent before he was badly wounded in Normandy. But I think he was talking more tactically rather than strategically.
Yeah, the quote that I remember is that he said that he'd never seen soldiers who had performed so poorly in their first battle, but so improved by the second battle. Or at least it's attributed to him anyway.
Yes, it certainly makes sense. And at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, which I do
Yes,
not include
exactly.
in this
Yeah.
book. Yep. And I do
Yeah.
not include that in this book because the Battle of Kasserine Pass was not, I do not see it as a strategic defeat. The U.S. was pushed back through the Kasserine Pass itself, of course, but staged a very impressive defensive holding position in front of Fala and Thalassia just a couple of days later, and forced Rommel to retreat back towards the Mediterranean. But it was in no way a strategic defeat in that it didn't change the strategic calculus on the ground, where the German and Italians were increasingly outnumbered and outflanked by both the British Army in the north as well as the Montgomery's Eighth Army from the south. So that's one reason it's not included in the book. But yes, the Americans did not perform well in the opening stages of Kasserine Pass. But I do think one thing that's overlooked is how well the U.S. Did perform just a couple of days later in the latter stages of what we know as the Battle of Kasserine Pass.
Thank you.
Great question, Mark. Mike, we'll go to you, and then Brandon, I see you're in the queue. Mike, your line should be open.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, now I should do full disclosure here before I get to the actual question, which is that I've done a lot of research into the Schweinfurt raids, and using my my training as in investigative reporting, I came to the conclusion pretty solidly that the Schweinfurt raids were not a defeat, but a victory for the United States, for the 8th Air Force, both tactically and strategically. But it was a costly victory. And the problem is that even though the purpose of the bomber, the primary purpose was to get the bombs on the target, or the target area, as they would call it. And they did that, both in first Schweinfurt, which was not designed to totally take out Schweinfurt. Actually, the RAF was supposed to come in that night, but they had a slightly more important mission to do, dealing with the V-1 rockets at Peenemünde. But the idea was, it was a victory. The bombing results were not spectacular, but they were good, and they were good enough. And it did cause damage. It did cause significant damage to German industry as a whole. Basically, I'm not going to, since this is just to buttress the question, I'm not going to get into, this is not my talk. But anyway, so if we go with my deduction that Schweinfurt was a victory, both Schweinfurt raids, but they were costly victories. And the cost was not necessarily defeatist. In other words, the cost, they could have continued to bomb without the fighter support and take those losses. However, the effect of public relations, if you want to say morale at home, more so than even with the bomber crews, was demanded of the 8th Air Force, of the strategic air forces, that they really do something to cut down the losses, to not proceed without cutting down the losses. Albert Speer said if they would have been willing to take these incredible losses, they could have basically stopped German industry in its track. I mean, he was he claimed he was really frightened of the success of the Schweinfurt raids. Also, by the way, German figures I found out were very unreliable due to the fact of the Nazi command structure. So wouldn't it be more of an argument to say that even in success, because of the, shall we say, that there was, let's say, a chink in the morale structure of not just the American forces, but the morale of the American public, that even in success, even if there were successful missions or successful battles, that the United States needed to, in order to continue, needed to cut down the costs and the perception in the mind of the public. And that would be the reason that whether it was a defeat or a victory, that was really one of the primary considerations, especially in the Schweinfurt raids. The primary consideration was to make sure that American morale in general, which basically was, let's say, not as stiff as, say, for example, British morale, but that was really the chink in the American armor, was basically the public perception and the Americans' ability at that time to take high losses, very high losses, in order to achieve an objective.
Mike, I definitely agree with much of what you said. And yes, Albert Speer wrote that it was the beginning of the end of the war, the day that this first Schweinfurt raid took place. And he did write that if the Americans and the British had kept hitting those plants, they would have led to a severe shortage in ball bearings. As it was, they had built up some stocks in advance. So even though production was cut by 30–40% at these factories at each of the raids, the production actually rose to higher numbers soon after, within a month. Also, Germany began to move its aircraft and ball bearing production into underground factories and disperse them to smaller factories, make it harder for the U.S. to hit them all. But I think you did put your finger on one important point here, is that certainly the 8th Air Force did pull back. It did have to suffer a strategic defeat. And twice after each Schweinfurt mission, for an entire month, it had to stop sending out bombers on long-distance raids because they couldn't handle the losses they were taking. One, as you said, because the loss of 60 bombers and 600 men in one day was a shock to the American public. And remember, we had not landed in France yet, so the number of losses we were taking on a monthly basis of total American killed and wounded was relatively low. It went way up in 1944. But it was also that if you continue to send your men out there in their bombers, and they had effectively a 100% chance that they were going to be killed in their course of mission or shot down. And it wasn't clear how many of those men actually survived. We didn't know until later how many became POWs versus KIA. The morale just collapsed, and the men would not fly, and they would not fly well, and they'd find reasons to turn back for perceived problems with their airplane. So it was both an ability to maintain unit cohesion as well as concerns about morale back at home. But again, we don't have to say it was a terrible defeat. It wasn't as bad a defeat as Pearl Harbor or the loss of New York City in the Revolutionary War, or how we almost lost the entire upper Midwest of the United States at the beginning of the War of 1812. But I would still argue that it was a defeat. It was a defeat because of the losses the U.S. suffered that day. It was a defeat because the U.S., for whatever reason, felt it had to change its tactics and its strategy after the mission, even though it may have been effective at cutting back on ball bearing production in Germany. I hope you can agree with at least some of the points I just made, and I agree with some of the ones that you made.
Yes, well, actually, yeah. I mean, the figures that I had point to much more of a success. That it was a victory, that the Schweinfurt raids were a victory, but it was simply the cost. And as far as morale goes, because I know my father was flying missions after Second Schweinfurt, and the morale of the crews, the morale might have been lower as far as they're thinking about their chances of getting back, but they still went on and did it. It didn't really affect, from what I found from talking to veterans, it didn't affect the effectiveness, didn't affect the effectiveness of the bomber crews. But there was a problem, and I guess the question is this a chink? Is this American ability to withstand losses, is that a chink in the American armor? The American ability, as far as morale, the ability of the American public to accept losses to achieve victory, would that be the chink in the American armor? That was a good question.
Okay, Mike, thanks a lot. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So first I want to try and throw a curveball just for fun, and ask you, how would your thesis apply to the American Civil War? And then the second thing I want to ask is, you know, especially for 20th century warfare, but really ever since the American Civil War, isn't the sort of vast resources in material, men, mineral, what that the United States has and gives them sort of a very long runway to correct mistakes more important than anything about American character? Most people don't think the Japanese changed anything in World War II. And if you study the Pacific in depth, you find out they tried a lot of things. They all failed because they were just overwhelmed because they were fighting half of the world with the industrial strength, with the industrial productivity power of Italy. So they weren't going to win that. And so, you know, and then the other thing I asked in a written form is, wouldn't the U-boat or the convoy war be a good illustration or a better illustration of the American way of war in World War II than the Eighth Air Force?
Okay, I've got three questions there to try and quickly answer. Civil War, Japan, convoy. In Civil War, I do have a chapter on the Civil War in the book. It runs from First and Second Bull Run and the First Peninsula Campaign in between, major U.S. defeats to Antietam, a very important victory. And it focuses more on, to a certain extent, on the fact that Lincoln was really the driving force there. And he realized that he needed many more men, and he needed to bring more of the country into the war. And most importantly, he had to figure out how to make the war about not just maintaining the Union, but also about emancipation of the slaves. And of course, he had the Emancipation Proclamation. He had it on his desk for months, and he needed a victory. And he finally got the victory at Antietam. It was a very bloody victory, bloodiest day in American history, but it allowed him to change the war, bring more Northerners into wanting to fight the war. Not just he was able to finagle keeping the people who wanted to fight for the Union, as well as those who were most interested in fighting for emancipation, and also brought in 10% of the Union armies by the end of the war were blacks. So he brought in many more. It was a force multiplier by pulling through the Emancipation Proclamation and reducing the labor force that the Confederacy could rely upon while increasing that of the Union. In terms of Japan, yeah, their strategy, and this goes back to the Mike's last question, was their plan in World War II, of course, was to set up a defensive perimeter in the Pacific, protecting their new industrial conquests that were going to allow their industry to be multiple times that of Italy. and thought that the U.S. just would be unwilling to take the losses required to fight their way through places like Tarawa and Peleliu. And they found out they were wrong. The U.S. was willing to take those losses. And yes, by the end of the war, they were very much overwhelmed by American industrial output. I believe there were 100 U.S. carriers afloat and in operation by the middle of 1945, or the late 45, the end of the war. But that doesn't change the fact that the U.S. was able to achieve victory at Midway after defeat at Pearl Harbor, and victory at Bunagona to stop the Japanese push to try to cut off Australia from the United States after the defeat in the Philippines in a relatively short period of time before massive industrial might from the U.S. was brought to bear. And then finally, in the convoy war, of course, Churchill said the loss of ships being sent to England was what really kept him up at night. But I think if you take a look at the book A Taste for War about food in war in World War II, you'll see that Britain never ran really low on food. They never had to ration bread or potatoes. Very different than what happened in other places in Germany or Leningrad, et cetera, during the war. And while certainly losses went way up and then came down when the U.S. started using long-range bombers to go after the U-boats, I don't know if I could see a specific strategic defeat there, but certainly that was, it follows much of the same pattern as other parts of the book, where the U.S. was able to utilize both industrial might as well as scientific know-how and putting new scientific discoveries into the field quickly that helped lead to victory. So I hope that answers your question, or at least satisfied some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. James, if you have a few minutes, there's a few questions in the Q&A box. I was just going to read them out
Sure.
to you. Perfect.
Go ahead.
Thomas asks, what attributes of the American character do you think account for our rapid adjustment? For instance, we have been more entrepreneurial than other societies. Are there other characteristics that stand out?
Thanks, Thomas. I think certainly the entrepreneurial nature of the U.S. and the U.S. is known as being great tinkerers and willing to try new things. Perhaps that entrepreneurial nature allows for more accepting of losses before going on to finding a way to find something that works. Perhaps the inherent American optimism is more of a positive, rather than thinking, oh, we've been defeated, we should go to the peace table and negotiate something. We've been optimistic. No, we'll be able to figure something out. And also perhaps the U.S. has been quite willing to sack generals and admirals that failed. Sometimes they've been sacked and it really wasn't their fault, like when Ira Eaker was effectively kicked upstairs to the Mediterranean and gave up control of the 8th Air Force in the example we were talking about. But except in this book, Washington was able to keep his position and move from defeat to victory. And MacArthur, also on the bottom of the picture on the cover, he was able to stay in place after a major defeat on to victory. But for all the other defeats, the U.S. changed the commander. So perhaps it's the entrepreneurialism, it's the tinkering, it's the optimism, and it's the willing to be ruthless and fire people who were not generating results that we hoped for.
Good. Charles asks, in modern warfare, do you think the U.S. will have the time to change tactics if we have not modernized our military before a war starts?
Thanks, Charles. This is something that I've thought about, and I'm just one voice, but I think that we are in very bad shape for what we seem to be hoping to fight a war against China, and I think we're trying to fight it on the wrong battlefield with the wrong weapons at the wrong time in the wrong place. I think we're trying to think about what perhaps the Chinese will do rather than what they can do. How do we know they're only going to try and take over, let's say, Taiwan? How do we know they're not going to shut down the U.S. electric grid or attack us in other places? And we're reliant on these very expensive weapon systems, such as the manned fighter jet, the aircraft carrier, the main battle tank, which increasingly in the warfare we're seeing in Ukraine, for example, seem to be weapon systems that cannot survive in combat anymore. So I'm just one voice, but I do think we are going down the same sort of line to the same sort of errors that led to initial major defeats in U.S. history, from all the way from the War of 1812 on the Great Lakes to Pearl Harbor in 41 and on. And but of course, I hope that perhaps diplomacy will win out. Hope that answers Charles's question.
Anonymous asks, as you alluded to earlier, many of the strategic turnarounds involve changes in command by the U.S. Any other examples of changes in command that made a difference in the other chapters of your book?
Okay, just running through them relatively quickly. In 1812, of course, we brought in Oliver Hazard Perry to take over the, build and take over a fleet in Lake Erie. Dearborn got sacked, and we brought in Harry Harrison and other generals, though Dearborn actually did a relatively good job. Of course, in the Civil War, McClellan got sacked, and we brought in Meade, who was successful, of course, at Gettysburg, and then Ulysses S. Grant. In the American South, in the Revolutionary War, Gates was defeated, as was Benjamin Lincoln, who actually suffered one of the biggest American defeats in the war. We lost an entire field army at Charlestown, down in the Carolinas. And then we eventually brought in Morgan and Nathaniel Greene, who led to victory. We just talked about the one in the war over Germany. In South Korea, it wasn't so much that we replaced General Walton Walker in Korea in the end of 1950, but he got killed in a car accident. And luckily, we brought in Matthew Ridgway, who's probably maybe one of the greatest American generals, if you look at what he was able to pull off through his career, particularly in Korea. And then also in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, we changed generals. And if you take a look at the course of those battles, while the American public may have given up on those wars before the military did, the military brought in new commanders, Petraeus being the most recent and well-known, who was able to change the face of battle on the battlefield, and at least stabilize the battlefield, so that we were able then to have our diplomats and the president negotiate an exit strategy that was acceptable to the American public. So a lot of times where we have replaced generals after major defeats. I hope that covers at least the list in the book that I have.
Aaron says, awesome talk. Thank you for a great book and discussion. What is your point of view on how the U.S. has a massive NCO system as a former E7? Also, the will to transform the U.S. command structure during battles peaks high intensity, changing command. I guess, changing the command right in the middle of battle. What's your view of that?
Okay, so first of all, having the non-commissioned officers, of course, has been the backbone of the American military since the founding of the U.S. Army, the Continental Army, for a long time. It has allowed for unit cohesion to be a lot stronger. It's allowed for, after defeats, to be able to refill the ranks and have the right superstructure on which to add on all those additional U.S. troops or airmen or sailors as they come in. So it has been, of course, very important, and it's surprising that when we see the success there, and when we see other nations' militaries like that of Russia/Soviet Union that do not utilize the NCO structure, and how they've been much less effective and needed longer periods of time to recover after defeats. Changing leadership at the top in the middle of warfare Thomas Ricks in his book, The Generals Through U.S. History, and particularly in World War II, talks about how relief has been a very important part of the U.S. being able to go on to victory. And he actually decries the fact that we don't fire generals and admirals as quickly as we should now in the period after World War II. And we just go about that through shorter rotation periods. And he sees that as a weakness in the U.S. military right now. I hope that helps out with Aaron's question.
Great. We'll close out. Don, I think you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute your line, Patton, and ask your question.
I would argue really three things, and you can comment on. If you look at the event that happened, I think it was last weekend. If you look at the coordination of bombers from Texas, if you look at fighters from Langley, if you look at the use of drones, if you look at Cyber Command turning off the lights in Venezuela, I think we've got a tremendously coordinated joint military. I'll just comment that. The other thing that I would argue is we are in transition right now with the use of drones. It's happening certainly big time. If you look at the tanks, we used to look at front and side armor. Now we're looking at bird cages over the tops because of drone warfare. I know that our military is in the process of ordering many. I've visited Fort Huachuca and other places to have some intimate knowledge of the expansion of our drone element into our more on a tactical basis, but an important part of the military in general. So, yeah, comment.
Sure, Don. Thank you very much. I certainly agree with you that jointness is something that's been a real positive that the military has worked on in the last 20, 30 years. And we saw some of the fruition of those efforts in the operation in Venezuela last weekend, which was a flawlessly staged operation and effective for the military. They were given a mission and they performed it. However, Venezuela is clearly not a peer or near peer competitor to the United States. A very weak military using significantly outdated military items and not even the best stuff.
I agree with that. Yeah,
okay.
I do. I do. And I'm not looking at the opposition. I'm just talking about the whole ability. But the jointness is a part of the Goldwater Nichols from the 80s, how that has really put together a total force structure. So
I agree with that. Clearly, it's not as if we're in a terrible shape, but the question is, are we building enough drones? Are we building the right sort of drones? Are we building them or using them and figuring out how to make changes on the fly as quickly as the Ukrainians have shown as possible? I think the answer to that is definitely a no. Are we continuing to try to build large weapon platforms that will not be survivable in tomorrow's battle? I mean, the Golden Fleet and these new battleships that are being built, many analysts who know what they're talking about say that these ships will not survive more than a couple of hours in the war of tomorrow. And are we still trying to build a lot of manned fighter jets and a lot of main battle tanks that, again, if you have to spend several $1 million on a tank and what's going to allow you to use it is $100 of birdcage welded to the top of it, I'm not sure that's the right weapon system to be building. So I'm just concerned that we are not reacting quickly enough, and our procurement system is not reacting quickly enough to take account of the revolution in military affairs that is taking place right now in the world. So that's just a concern.
I think it was yesterday that I saw a headline that Trump said he was going to pull contracts away from Raytheon if they don't get their manufacturing accelerated. So
Yeah, I don't want to get involved with President Trump because he
no,
is
no,
such a
no,
polarizing
no,
figure.
no.
I definitely agree. I agree that certainly that is the sort of step we want to see in our procurement system, is these multi-billion-dollar weapon platforms that become 3 or 4 or 5x the initial cost because of our very basically monopoly players we have that build the weapon systems. And perhaps we need to move on to something that's more nimble and can change more quickly and can learn from what's taking place right now in Ukraine, for example.
Well, another thing I would add, you know, the F-15 E model was on the way out, and that has been upgraded, and there have been recent purchases by the U.S. Air Force, not only of the E, but of the enhanced, I think it's called the EX now. And so rather than, maybe moving forward, which they are with the new advanced fighter, but they're also using some of the effective, maybe older platforms, and if they were effective, continue to use them because they're certainly at a lesser cost.
I, I think these are all points, effective points. The U.S. has a very effective military right now. My concern is just how can we avoid making the same mistakes we've made at the beginning of other wars in the past. And I see some of the same attributes taking place right now. So that's just my concern. And I'm not saying that
we're always fighting the last war, aren't we?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Hey, Don, James,
Thanks.
how are you doing on time? There's a few
I'm
more.
fine if you have another question.
Yeah, Vincent, I just saw you raise your hand. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah. Am I unmuted?
We can hear you if you.
Oh, yeah. So many of you know that I'm a 9/11 first responder decorated by Congress, and I get the opportunity to go to these conferences where they talk about security. And, when we mentioned losing wars, we did lose, there was 2,977 people who died on 9/11. And there's over 50,000 people that are in the 9/11 health program. And to date, over 8,000 Americans have died from their 9/11 injuries. So it's interesting. It's it's not considered a war, but it is a major, I don't know what you historians would like to categorize this tragedy as. I mean, and so they have, next year's the 25th anniversary, and I get invited to these conferences and webinars, and people from the United States go online and explain that we're safer and there's not going to be another 9/11, and they learned from 9/11, and there's no proof that there couldn't be another 9/11. So I just, where does 9/11 fall into? I mean, is it a battle we lost?
Great, thanks, Vincent.
Sure, Vincent, I definitely agree. And again, I mentioned that the last chapter in the book is perhaps more controversial because it talks about what happened in Vietnam as part of the overarching Cold War and the domino theory that was promulgated first by Eisenhower, and then 9/11 and the global war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. And yes, certainly 9/11 was similar in its impact, maybe even greater in its impact in terms of the effect on the U.S. economy versus the attack on Pearl Harbor. Right afterwards, George W. Bush promulgated the global war on terror. Perhaps he should have called it the global war on radicalized Islamic terrorism, but that would have been even more of a mouthful than the GWAT. it unfortunately, the absence of an event doesn't necessarily prove of the effectiveness of everything we've spent to try and have that event not take place. But I guess those who were in favor of the global war on terror can point to the fact that it's been 25 years and we have not suffered another major attack like that. And perhaps Afghanistan is not not as much of a hotbed of Islamic uncertainty anymore, and neither is Iraq. I would point out that when the GWOT was first announced, the real concern was that another hegemonic power would arise in the Eastern Hemisphere that would be able to threaten the United States and the Western. And that has been our overarching strategic policy since the days of James Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine being enunciated. And we were concerned that a major Islamic caliphate stretching from Afghanistan, maybe to Morocco, controlling a great deal of the world's energy reserves and its population mass, would arise and be able to threaten us. It seems hard to believe that that was really a concern perhaps now, but it was certainly a concern then, and all the efforts and the spending and the loss of life and the blood and treasure the U.S. has expended at least has kept that from happening. You can't necessarily know for sure if it wouldn't have happened in the absence of those efforts, but it certainly has. So again, was 9/11, Vincent, to answer your question, I certainly believe 9/11 was a great American defeat. It was an American defeat similar to what we saw in Pearl Harbor, or in some ways in the Philippines at the beginning of World War II. And we fought a 25-year war, which has achieved its goals to date. And we can argue over whether it was worth the cost, and if those goals really were reasonable goals. But I think many can say that so far we've been winning the global war on terror, as enunciated by the U.S. security establishment and the President of the United States.
Perfect. I think that's a good place to end our lecture today. Thank you to our speaker, James, for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Seeds of Victory, Defeat, Triumph, and the American Way of War by James Ellman. Please join us next Saturday, January 17th at 1 p.m. when historian Mark Milner will discuss his book, Second Front, Anglo-American Rivalry and the Hidden Story of the Normandy Campaign, which offers a new account of the Second World War and how bitter competition between the Allies would shape the post-war world. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. For James, thank you especially for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our talk next week. Until then, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, James.